Welcome to Beyond Illusions, where we explore transformative books, lectures, and ideas to uncover truths that enrich your life. In each episode, we challenge harmful beliefs and dive into spiritual insights to help you break free from illusions and embrace deeper wisdom. Today, we're going to be looking at a book called How the Bible Actually Works by Peter Enns.
I like that title.
The title really grabbed me. I was like, how does the Bible actually work? I mean, we talk about it all the time, but do we ever really think about how it functions, how it's speaking to us across millennia and all of that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And Enns tackles this head on in this book. And he argues that I think a lot of us stumble over the Bible because we come to it with all of these modern expectations that just don't line up with how the Bible itself actually kind of behaves.
Yeah.
He actually calls it the weirdness of the Bible. Yeah. And he suggests that taking the Bible seriously actually means lining into this weirdness, not shying away from it.
So it's less about trying to force the Bible into our modern mold,
right,
and more about understanding it on its own terms, its own kind of unique, DNA, I guess you could say.
Exactly. And he highlights three key aspects of this DNA: the Bible's antiquity, its ambiguity, and its diversity.
Okay, so three biggies.
He argues that these aren't bugs, these are features. This is what makes the Bible a book of wisdom for life, not just a set of rules or something like that. It's actually an invitation to a more mature and adaptable approach to faith.
I like that.
Yeah.
And the book really digs into a few key questions that I think are really helpful to kind of frame our conversation. How can we understand a God who seems so different from the way we experience God today? How do we interpret verses that seem to clash with our modern values or our modern understanding? And how do we make sense of all the different viewpoints that are presented within the Bible itself?
These are questions that have challenged believers for centuries, and the book offers a really great framework, I think, for approaching these questions in a way that is both intellectually honest and spiritually enriching.
I love that. Let's unpack these one by one, starting with antiquity. I know we all know that the Bible is old, but how does that oldness trip us up?
Well, think about this. The time between us and somebody like King David is the same as the time between us and the year 5000.
Oh, wow.
That's a mind-blowing amount of time. And that just means that the Bible was written in a world that is vastly different from ours, with a totally different worldview. And that distance can create a real challenge when we're trying to reconcile the Bible's ancient worldview with our own.
It really does. It really highlights that gap between assumptions of the ancient world and our modern understanding.
The ancient Israelites had a completely different understanding of the universe of life itself.
It's like trying to have a conversation with someone from a completely different culture. You have to understand their background and their way of thinking to really grasp what they're trying to say.
Precisely. And one of the biggest differences between the ancient world and our own is the way they understood the natural world. For them, there was no separation between the spiritual and the physical.
Okay.
Everything that happened in the world, storms, earthquakes, disease, was seen as a direct act of God.
So like that time, Pat Robertson suggested a hurricane was God's punishment.
That kind of thinking was completely normal in biblical times. But today we know that hurricanes are caused by complex weather patterns, not by divine retribution.
Right, but the Bible doesn't talk about weather patterns. It talks about God controlling the winds and the waves. And it's not just about natural disasters. The Bible portrays God as a king, a warrior, even a vengeful figure at times. And these are concepts that made perfect sense in the ancient context. But they can feel pretty jarring to us today.
And that's where the challenge comes in. We have to bridge the gap between our modern scientific understanding and the ancient worldview that's reflected in the Bible.
So how do we do that? Do we just ignore the parts that seem outdated or unscientific?
So Enns argues that we have to reimagine what God might look like now in our modern context.
Reimagining God. I have to admit, that makes me a little nervous. Sounds a little too liberal, no?
I get it. A lot of us are taught to treat the Bible as the absolute unchanging word of God. But he argues the Bible itself shows us how people have had to adapt their understanding of God throughout history, to fit their changing reality.
That's interesting. Can you give us an example?
Take the portrayal of Jehu. In 2 Kings, God is totally on board with Jehu's bloody massacre of King Ahab's descendants. Then you go to the prophet Hosea, and God condemns that very same act.
Wow, that's a big difference. How do we even begin to make sense of that?
It highlights that the Bible isn't this static, unchanging document dictated from on high.
Okay.
It's a collection of texts written by real people grappling with their faith in light of their own experiences and understandings,
Right.
and sometimes they arrived at different conclusions.
So it's like the Bible itself is modeling for us the importance of theological diversity and open-mindedness?
Yeah.
Exactly, and it goes even deeper than that.
Okay.
It's not just about different writers having different opinions.
Right.
It's about the very nature of God being presented in different ways.
I'm starting to see what he means. But how do we make sure we're not just twisting the Bible to fit our modern ideas?
That's where wisdom comes in. He's not saying we throw out the Bible or ignore the parts we don't like. It's about engaging with the text, really wrestling with it, and seeking guidance from the Holy Spirit as we interpret it.
So reimagining God is less about changing God and more about deepening our understanding.
Exactly. It demonstrates that reimagining God, engaging with the text in light of our own context and understanding, isn't just an option. It's something we're called to do.
So we're not just imposing our modern values on the Bible. We're actually trying to understand the deeper principles at play and how those principles might be applied in new ways as our understanding evolves.
Precisely. Another example is the way that the Bible often portrays blessings and punishments in a transactional way. You know, you do good, you get rewarded. You do bad, you get punished. This made sense in a world where people believed that their actions directly influence the whims of the gods.
Right.
But that doesn't quite resonate with our understanding of God's grace and love, which is freely given regardless of our actions.
So we have to ask ourselves, what is the deeper truth the Bible's trying to convey here? Is it about this quid pro quo relationship with God, or is it about the natural consequences of our choices, both good and bad?
Yeah, and you know, this whole reimagining process, it seems especially relevant when we consider the Bible's emphasis on God's honor. In the ancient world, honor was everything. It was tied to your social status, to power, even to your very identity. So when the Bible talks about defending God's honor, it's using the language and concepts of that world. But what does that mean for us today? How do we honor God in a world where those ancient notions of honor don't hold the same sway?
It's a really good question.
And that brings us to the second quality, the Bible's ambiguity. He says, instead of seeing unanswered questions as a weakness, we should see it as a strength.
Hold on, how can not having clear answers be a good thing? Wouldn't that just lead to everyone interpreting the Bible however they want?
It could, but he believes it forces us to think, to develop our own wisdom and discernment. Take Proverbs 26.4-5, for example. It offers seemingly contradictory advice about how to deal with fools.
Okay.
It first says, do not answer fools according to their folly, or you will be a fool yourself. But then, a few verses later, it says, answer fools according to their folly, or they will be wise in their own eyes.
Wait, how are we supposed to make sense of that? It's like completely opposite advice.
Right. It's like those optical illusions where you can see two different images depending on how you're looking at it.
Right.
That's his point. It's not about blind rules. Sometimes the wise thing is to ignore a fool. Other times, it's necessary to stand up to them. The Bible kind of requires us to engage with it actively, using wisdom and discernment to figure out what it means for us in our particular context. And that's where the Bible's ambiguity becomes a strength. It forces us to engage with the text on a deeper level, to wrestle with its complexities, and to seek guidance from the Holy Spirit as we discern its meaning for our lives.
It's like that classic proverb about raising children. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Sounds great in theory. As any parent knows, parenting is anything but one-size-fits-all endeavor.
Right. What works for one kid might be disastrous for another. That proverb, like so many others, requires discernment and adaptation in real-life situations.
Yeah.
It's about developing wisdom.
Yeah.
Yeah. It can feel like that sometimes, but remember, the Bible wasn't written to spoon-feed us answers.
Right.
It was written to challenge us, to think critically, and to grow in our understanding of God.
I guess that makes sense. But if the Bible isn't giving us a clear roadmap,
Right.
how do we know we're on the right track? How do we know we're not just making things up to fit our own beliefs?
That's a valid concern, and it's where the popular modern view of the Bible as a simple rule book can actually lead us astray, because it encourages us to look for easy answers and to avoid the hard work of wrestling with ambiguity.
So you're saying that embracing the Bible's ambiguity is actually a more honest approach to faith?
I believe it is because it acknowledges the limits of our human understanding and recognizes that our relationship with God is a journey, not a destination.
It's about the process, not just the product.
Exactly. And that process involves wrestling with difficult passages and being open to the possibility that our understanding of God might change and evolve over time.
Even seemingly straightforward commands can be really open to interpretation and debate. Take the Sabbath, for example. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Seems pretty clear, right?
Right. Until you try to define work. That includes checking your email, driving to see your family. The Bible doesn't offer like a super detailed instruction manual for every situation. And that ambiguity is a big part of what makes the Bible both fascinating and frustrating.
Absolutely. So the book identifies 3 key reasons for this ambiguity. First, changing circumstances. What is it about?
Take the Babylonian exile as an example. Imagine you're an Israelite living in Jerusalem.
Right.
And suddenly your whole world is turned upside down. You're ripped from your land. Your temple is destroyed.
Right.
Your entire way of life is just shattered.
Wow. Talk about a crisis of faith.
Exactly. Suddenly all of those like centuries-old traditions and laws don't seem to fit anymore. The Bible doesn't give us easy answers for how to deal with this kind of upheaval.
Yeah.
But it does show us how people wrestled with their faith in the midst of really difficult times.
So it's less about finding the perfect rule for every situation.
Right.
And more about learning to adapt, to reinterpret our faith in light of new and unexpected challenges.
That's it.
That's a good way to put it.
The second reason for ambiguity that the lectures talk about is that language evolves.
Yes.
Words change their meaning over time, and that can create a lot of confusion for us as modern readers.
Right. How the word hell doesn't quite capture the nuances of the original Greek terms that were used in the New Testament.
It's important to remember that the Bible wasn't written in modern English.
Right.
And to make things even more complex, talking about third reason for ambiguity, even if it were language itself, has inherent limitations. Written communication is inherently ambiguous. Even in a text message to your best friend, there's always room for misinterpretation.
Sure.
Even in face-to-face conversations, we often misunderstand each other.
And that brings us to the third element of the Bible's baked-in weirdness, which is its diversity. And this is where it gets really interesting, because it challenges this idea that the Bible is this monolithic, perfectly harmonious text.
The Bible isn't afraid to present different and even conflicting viewpoints. It's a collection of writings spanning centuries written by different authors with different perspectives, and that diversity is reflected in the text itself. For example, Enns talks about God's attitude toward the Assyrians. It seems to completely change between the book of Jonah and the book of Nahum. In Jonah, God is compassionate, merciful, wanting to spare them, but in Nahum, God is vengeful, bringing judgment.
That's a big difference. So did God change his mind?
Well, he suggests the difference isn't that God changed, but that the two writers were writing from different historical contexts with different theological emphasis. Jonah was writing when the Assyrians were a powerful threat, while Nahum wrote after they were defeated, when the memory of their cruelty was fresh.
So each writer's understanding of God was influenced by the events, the culture of their time.
Yes, and he gives another example with the idea of intergenerational punishment. In Ezekiel, it says each person will be judged for their own actions, not for what their parents did. But in Exodus, we see this idea that the consequences of sin can be passed down.
That's a tough one to reconcile.
He points to historical context again. Ezekiel was writing during the Babylonian exile. The people were struggling with why they were suffering for their ancestors' sins. So he offered a view of God that emphasized individual accountability, which was relevant and comforting at that time.
So we're seeing how those different perspectives, even if they seem to clash, can offer a richer, a more complex picture of God.
Absolutely. But for many people, that's a stumbling block.
Right.
They want the Bible to present a consistent and unambiguous view of God. And when it doesn't, they get confused or even disillusioned.
They want God to fit neatly into a box. And when God spills out over the edges, they don't know what to do.
That's a great way to put it. But the beauty of the Bible is that it refuses to let us put God in a box. It forces us to confront the complexity and mystery of God.
But how do we even begin to make sense of these seemingly contradictory portrayals of God?
Well, one approach is to recognize that the Bible is reflecting the real-life experiences of people wrestling with their faith over centuries. These weren't theologians sitting in ivory towers. They
Right.
were living through wars, exiles, political upheavals. They were trying to make sense of their own suffering.
And the suffering of their people and their understanding of God evolved and changed as they went through these experiences.
So the Bible isn't just a theological textbook.
Right.
It's a collection of stories and poems and prophecies that reflect the messy, complicated reality of human experience.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so relatable even thousands of years later.
Right.
Because we're still grappling with those same questions,
Yeah.
those same struggles, those same doubts.
We're still trying to figure out who God is and how God fits into our lives.
We are. And the Bible doesn't give us easy answers.
Right.
But it does give us a framework for asking the right questions.
Okay.
It invites us into an ongoing conversation about faith, about God, about what it means to live a meaningful life in a world that's often confusing and painful.
Yeah. This is starting to make more sense. So instead of trying to force the Bible into a neat, tidy box, we need to embrace its diversity and its ambiguity.
Right. And when we do that, we open ourselves up to a much richer and more nuanced understanding of faith. And he argues that this is not only okay, but actually essential for a living and relevant faith in our world today.
That's his main point. He even goes as far as to say that if we believe that God is against slavery, that he wants us to care for the environment, if we believe those things, we've already reimagined the God of the Bible. And there's one more example of New Testament reimagining that I think is really important.
Okay, what is it?
The crucifixion.
A crucifixion. What's so radically different about that?
Well, it's a central part of Christian theology, right?
Right.
But think about how it completely flips the script on the traditional understanding of sacrifice. In the Old Testament, humans offer sacrifices to God as a way of appeasing him, of atoning for their sins. But in the crucifixion, we see God offering himself as a sacrifice for humanity.
So it's a complete reversal of the power dynamic.
It is.
Instead of humans trying to earn God's favor, God is reaching out to humans, offering unconditional love and forgiveness.
Exactly. It's a radical departure from both Jewish and Greco-Roman ideas about God. And not only that, but the crucifixion also challenges those ancient notions of honor and shame. Remember how we talked about how important honor was in the ancient world?
Yeah.
Well, crucifixion was the ultimate form of humiliation, a way of publicly shaming and degrading a person.
So it's mind-blowing that God would willingly embrace that humiliation, that shame, for the sake of love.
And it completely upends the power structures of the ancient world. It says that true power doesn't come from dominance or control, but from humility and self-sacrifice.
So what does all this mean for us? If the New Testament writers were reinterpreting God in light of Jesus, does that give us permission to do the same today?
That's exactly what Enns is arguing for.
Okay.
He says we're not just passively receiving a fixed set of doctrines or beliefs. We're actively engaging with the tradition, questioning, challenging, allowing our understanding of God to grow and evolve.
So we're not just reading the Bible, we're having a conversation with it.
That's a great way to put it. And in that ongoing conversation, in that wrestling, we find ourselves growing closer to God, even if the God we discover looks different than the one we thought we knew.
This is heavy stuff. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface.
I know, right?
So after this deep dive into Enns' book, how would you sum up how the Bible actually works?
I think Enns is essentially arguing that the Bible isn't a rule book, but a conversation starter. It's an invitation to engage with God on a deeper level, to wrestle with the text, and to discover new and unexpected truths along the way.
And it's a reminder that that conversation isn't limited to just us. In the text, we're joining a chorus of voices, biblical writers, theologians, everyday believers, all wrestling with these same questions across time and cultures.
Exactly. And it's in that shared struggle and that communal wrestling that we find meaning, purpose, and connection.
So to bring it all home, Enns' message seems to be that the Bible's weirdness, its ambiguity and diversity isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's what makes the Bible so compelling, so challenging, so ultimately life-giving.
Beautifully put.
And as we do that, we discover that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about the courage to ask the tough questions and the humility to admit we don't know everything.
So as we wrap up, here's a final thought-provoking question to leave our listeners with. If the Bible is this dynamic, ongoing conversation between God and humanity, where do you see yourself in that conversation? What questions are you wrestling with? Where do you find yourself challenged, comforted, or inspired?
That's a great question to ponder.
Yeah.
And it's one that I hope will stay with our listeners long after this deep dive is over. So keep seeking, keep questioning, keep wrestling, and see where the Spirit leads you.